The kitchen at Ashvale was always hottest in the hour before supper, when 3 fires burned at once and the steam from the boiling copper turned the air to something you could almost chew. Nora Peel had worked in that heat for 6 years, and she had never once minded it. She minded other things, and she minded them in silence, which was, as her mother had told her before she died, the only safe currency a woman in service could spend. She minded it on the 14th of October when she heard voices in the passage behind the dry larder, the narrow stone corridor that ran between the cold room and the butler's pantry, and which nobody used after 4 in the afternoon because the candles there had not been replaced in summer. She minded it silently, with a ladle still in her hand and her breath gone flat in her chest. While the voices said what they said, 2 drops in the claret, said the first voice. It belonged to Mr. Bratt, Crewe, the house steward, whose footsteps she had known since her first week at Ashvale. No more. Too much, and it reads as something other than a weak heart. He is not yet 40, said the second voice. Lower, more careful. A woman's voice that Nora placed after a moment as belonging to Lady Gretchen Vane, the Baron's widowed cousin who had arrived 3 weeks ago with 3 trunks and a manner of moving through the house as though she had already redecorated it in her mind. Men of 40 die of weak hearts every year, Crewe said, especially men who drink claret alone. A silence, then Lady Vane said, after the wedding, not before. He must sign the settlement first. Nora did not move. The ladle in her hand weighed nothing, and everything at once. She stood in the steam of her own kitchen, and she heard the footsteps withdraw down the passage, and she remained where she was. For what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes, she could not have said which. Then she turned back to her pots, and she held her tongue. She would like you to understand that it was not cowardice. It was, or she told herself it was, something closer to arithmetic. She was Nora Peel, the cook at Ashvale Park, the daughter of a country apothecary who had left her nothing but a box of remedies and the Latin names for 100 herbs. She had no money, no family connections, no letter of reference beyond the one signed by the previous housekeeper, who was herself now dead. She had a fire to tend and a wedding supper to plan, and the knowledge of something she could not prove, housed in a body with no standing to make accusations against a house steward and a titled widow. And then there was the matter of the Baron himself. Lord Edmund Ashford, Baron Ashvale, was 38 years old, and had the quality of stillness that certain men acquire when grief has run through them long enough to become structure rather than surface. He had lost his wife 4 years ago, and the loss had not broken him so much as pared him down. He was not cold, precisely. He was economical. He spoke in short, level sentences. He walked through his own house as though taking careful measurements of a space he had not yet decided whether to keep. The kitchen was beneath his notice, as kitchens were meant to be. Yet twice in the 6 years she had worked at Ashvale, Lord Ashford had come down to the kitchen himself, rather than sending instructions through the steward, and both times had been after losses, beginning with the morning his wife died, when he had stood in the kitchen doorway at 6 in the morning and asked without explanation whether she could manage a broth for the children, and once the following winter, when the youngest of his 2 wards had been ill with a fever, and he had appeared again at the same hour with the same quality of contained, careful grief, and asked in the same low voice whether she knew anything that might help. She had known things in both cases, and they had helped, and he had thanked her with a courtesy that was not performative, but simply the habit of a man who had been raised to understand that labor deserved acknowledgment, regardless of station. He had not come down since. She did not flatter herself that she was anything to him. He did not know her name beyond Peel, which was how he addressed all the kitchen staff. She was the cook at Ashvale, as much a fixture as the copper pots, and fixtures did not receive the confidence of barons. And yet she held her tongue for him. She held it with something that felt, if she was honest with herself, in the quiet of the kitchen at midnight when the fires were banked and the house was still, like the particular ache of a thing you are not permitted to do and cannot stop wanting to do anyway. The wedding was to be in 3 weeks. It had been announced at the beginning of September, when Lady Vane had been at Ashvale for less than a fortnight. The house had received the announcement with a kind of collective adjustment, the way a machine recalibrates when a new part is inserted without consultation. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, had said, "Well," and then said nothing else. The maids had formed and disbanded 3 separate opinions before supper. The footman had polished extra silver without being asked. And Nora had been handed a note in Crewe's handwriting before she knew what Crewe was capable of, detailing the requirements for the wedding, breakfast, and the supper to follow: 38 covers, 2 removes, a cake of 4 tiers. She had begun planning the menus the same afternoon. She had been doing this kind of thing long enough to understand that the work itself was the one thing she could control, and so she controlled it. It was the work that had first brought her to Lord Ashford's attention, if attention was the correct word for something that happened through intermediaries and referenced only practical competencies. Mrs. de Casanshire. Holt had told her that his lordship had inquired specifically after the cook following the Christmas dinner 3 years ago, and that he had said the soup was as good as any he had eaten in London, which Mrs. B.A. Holt delivered as though it were a communication of some consequence, and then went back to her account books. Nora had thanked her and gone back to the kitchen. She had thought about it more than she should have. She was not a woman who permitted herself many interior luxuries, but she had thought about it, the particular quality of a mind that would find its way to the soup through the formalities of a Christmas dinner, and trouble itself to say so. She thought about it again. Now, in October, in the dark of the kitchen, after the fires were banked with the knowledge she carried sitting in her chest like a coal that would not cool. The following morning she went to the dry larder and stood in the passage for a long time, looking at the stone floor where the voices had stood. There was nothing to see. There was never anything to see in these situations. That was the entire problem. She had no vial, no letter, no witness. She had the sound of 2 voices in a dark passage and the terrible clarity of what they had said, and she could no more walk to Lord Ashford's study with that clarity than she could walk to the magistrate's with it. She thought about the settlement Lady Vane had mentioned. She did not know the details of it, but she understood enough of how these arrangements worked to know that a widow, who had been at a house for 3 weeks and had managed to secure an engagement to the widower within that time, was a woman who had done considerable arithmetic of her own. The question was what the settlement contained, and what its signing would cost Lady Vane in the event that the Baron lived to regret it. She went back to her kitchen and began the morning bread. If there was a dismissive label that the house had settled on for her, it came from Crewe himself, who had been at Ashvale for 11 years and who managed the staff with the efficiency of a man who categorized people early and saw no reason to revise his categories. "The cook minds her kitchen," he said, at the start of her 3rd year when she had ventured an opinion at the servants' hall about the quality of the wine being served at dinner. He had not raised his voice. He had simply said it, pleasantly and finally, and the table had heard it as a verdict rather than a comment. The cook minds her kitchen. After that, opinions from the kitchen were received in the servants' hall with a kind of polite inattention, and Nora had learned to keep hers there among the pots. She minded her kitchen. She planned the wedding supper menus and ordered the provisions and organized the kitchen girls, and said nothing about what she had heard. And in the 2nd week of November, with the wedding 12 days away, something happened that she had not planned for. Lord Ashford came down to the kitchen. It was 7:30 in the morning, the same hour he had come before. She was alone. The kitchen girl had not yet arrived, and the fire was just catching. She heard the step on the back stair and knew it before she saw him, because there was a quality to his tread that was distinct from any other member of the household, deliberate and unhurried, and somehow carrying its own weather. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, which was where he always stopped, as though he understood that the kitchen was not his territory and required a kind of permission before entering it. He looked, she thought, tired in a way that was different from the ordinary tiredness of a man who slept badly. There was something careful about his face that morning, a quality of watching his own expressions, as though some private calculation was proceeding behind whatever expression the house was meant to see. "Peel," he said. "My lord," she said, and did not put down the bread she was shaping, because to stop working in his presence would be to make more of his presence than he intended, and she had learned that much. The tea, he said. Then he stopped. Mrs. Holt tells me. The kitchen orders the household tea. Yes, my lord, I order it through Mr. Crewe. A pause. He looked at the work table and then at the fire. I have found this autumn supply unsuitable, he said. I should like to change the order. It was not, she understood, about the tea. She knew it was not about the tea because, in 6 years, the tea had never once been unsuitable. Because she had been ordering the same blend from the same merchant in Bath since her 2nd month at Ashvale, and Lord Ashford had never once remarked upon it. She knew it was not about the tea because his eyes, when he finally met hers across the kitchen, had a quality of seeing rather than the quality of receiving information, which was what people's eyes did when they were actually talking about tea. She set down the bread. My lord, she said carefully, is there something specific about the order that concerns you? I would prefer, he said, in the same level voice, to deal with the merchant directly rather than through the household accounts. She understood that too. To deal with the merchant directly was to remove Crewe from the transaction. To remove Crewe from the transaction was to trust nothing that passed through Crewe's hands. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She kept her face still, because she had learned that too. I can provide you with the merchant's direction, she said. He is a reliable man. I have dealt with him for some years. Good, he said. And then after a pause that was a little longer than the practical transaction required. Are you well, Peel? It was such an unexpected question that she nearly said something she could not afford to say. She caught herself. Quite well, my lord. Thank you. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went back up the stairs. And she stood in her kitchen with her hands on the work table, and the bread going slightly cold under her palms, and understood that something had shifted. Although she could not have said precisely what, or how, only that it had. 2 days later, she was called to Mrs. Holt's sitting room. Mrs. Holt was a woman of 50, with the face of someone who had been managing the consequences of other people's decisions for so long that she had developed a permanent expression of braced patience. She looked at Nora across the width of her desk and said without particular inflection, His lordship has asked me to inquire after the source of the preserved plum you use in the November pudding. Nora knew perfectly well that Lord Ashford had not asked about the preserved plum. She said, I shall write it down for you, and wrote the name of the supplier in Bath, which was not the supplier of the preserved plum, because there was no preserved plum in the November pudding, and handed the paper to Mrs. Holt. Holt looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Nora with the particular expression of a woman who understood when a conversation was actually about something else. Thank you, she said. That will be all. The paper, Nora understood later, was not about the plum either. It was Mrs. Holt telling her in the only language available to them that she was not alone in what she had noticed. She was not alone. This mattered more than she had expected. The wedding supper preparations accelerated through the last week of November. The kitchen was never quiet now, and Nora managed it with the practiced calm of someone who understood that the way to get through the hours before a crisis was to work through them, not around them. She made the pastry, and the sauces, and the 4-tiered cake, and the cold jellies, and she tasted everything that left her kitchen, which she always did, because her name was attached to it, and she did not permit her name to be attached to anything she had not verified. On the 3rd night before the wedding, she was checking the wine stores. She did not go to the wine stores as a general rule. That was Crewe's domain, and she had no standing there. She went that night because the claret that had been specified for the top table had been ordered through the kitchen accounts at Lord Ashford's request, a quiet adjustment that had passed through her hands 3 weeks earlier without comment, and she was its custodian in a way that Crewe could not override without marking the change. She went with a lamp, and she checked the bottle she had received, and she found what she had half expected to find. 2 of them not quite where she had left them, the seals not quite matching the particular press. She remembered. She stood in the wine cellar for a long time. Then she took those 2 bottles and replaced them with 2 others, from a case that had been stored under her own key in the kitchen. A case she had ordered for the kitchen's cooking purposes, and which had never passed through Crewe's inventory. She carried the replaced bottles upstairs, wrapped in cloth, and she put them in the locked cupboard where she kept the medicinal stores that had belonged to her father. And she held her tongue one more night, and then she went to Mrs. Holt. It was past 11. Mrs. Holt was still awake, which Nora had known she would be, because women in their positions were always awake past 11, in the days before a great occasion. She knocked and was admitted, and she set the 2 cloth-wrapped bottles on Mrs. Holt's table, and she said as plainly as she could manage, "I need these to be examined by someone who knows what to look for before they go near the table tomorrow. I cannot be the one to take them to his lordship. Someone must." Holt looked at the bottles, and then at Nora, and the braced patient's expression shifted into something that had more of fear in it, but also more of resolution. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since October." A silence. Mrs. Holt said, "Why did you wait?" "Because I had no proof that would hold," Nora said. "And because I did not know how many members of this household were aware and did not act, and I could not risk being the person who accused and was discredited before anything could be done. I needed something I could hand to someone and say, 'Here is the thing itself, not the sound of voices.' The thing." Mrs. Holt closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and picked up the bottles and said, "Go back to your kitchen." Nora went back to her kitchen. The following morning, the morning before the wedding, Lord Ashford came down to the kitchen. A third time. It was the same hour, 7:30, the same quality of deliberate step. This time he did not stop in the doorway. He came in. The kitchen girls had not yet arrived. Nora was alone with the bread and the fires and the very particular silence of a morning that has not yet declared itself. He stood across the work table from her. He was not wearing his coat. He was in shirt sleeves and waistcoat which was so far outside the ordinary choreography of their interactions that she did not know where to put her eyes, and settled for the bread. "Peel," he said, "my lord." A pause. Then he said without preamble, "Mrs. Holt has spoken to me. She said nothing." "The bottles," he said, "and what you heard in October." He looked at the work table. "You held this for 6 weeks." She kept her hands in the bread. "I could not bring you a sound, my lord. I needed something you could act on. You could have spoken sooner." "To what end?" Crewe would have said I had misheard. Lady Vane would have said I was a jealous servant seeking to disrupt the household without the bottles. "I had nothing but my word, and my word," she said, as steadily as she could manage, "has a particular value in this house." She did not say it bitterly. She said it as a fact, because it was one, and he received it as one. He was quiet for long enough that the bread under her hands had grown warm from the heat of the kitchen. Then he said in a voice she had not heard him use before, lower and more stripped of its usual architecture, "You were protecting yourself, or protecting what you could not afford to lose." "Yes," she said, "both." "And in doing so," he said, "you were also protecting me." She looked up at that, because she could not help it. He was watching her across the work table with an expression she did not have a category for, something that had been assembled from a material she had not previously seen in his face. "I was doing what I could with what I had," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is what I said." She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked back at the bread, because the alternative was to say something she could not afford to say, and she had been holding her tongue for 6 weeks, and she knew how. "The matter will be resolved today," he said. "Crewe has been taken to the magistrate. Lady Vane's things are being removed from the guest rooms this morning." A pause. "The wedding will not take place." "I am sorry, my lord," she said, because it was the correct thing to say. "Are you?" he said without inflection but not without interest. She considered the question honestly. "About the inconvenience," she said. "Yes." Something happened in his face that she thought might, in another man, have been the outer edge of something like amusement. It was very brief. Then it was gone, And he was looking at the work table again, and she was looking at the bread. "The wedding supper," he said. "The preparations are completed, my lord. The kitchen is fully provisioned for 38 covers, and will remain provisioned for some days." "I see." He was quiet. "I am sorry for the waste." "Provisions do not go to waste in a household this size," she said. "We will make good use of them." "Of course." He put one hand flat on the work table, and she noticed it with the peripheral attention she had developed over 6 years, the way the hand was broad and careful and still. "Peel," he said, "my lord. I do not know your given name." The sentence landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the rings of it spread out through her chest. "Nora," she said. "Peel by surname." He repeated it quietly, not as an experiment, but as a thing being placed carefully into memory. Nora. It was the first time her given name had been in his voice, and it did something to the quality of the morning that she would not be able to explain afterward. A shift in the air, in the way the light came through the kitchen window, in the weight of the bread under her hands. He did not say anything else. He looked at her across the work table for one long moment, and then went back up the stairs, and she stood in her kitchen alone, and the bread was ready, and the fires were burning, and she let herself, just once, close her eyes. If you have stayed this far, you will know what she felt then, even if she did not have words for it yet, and perhaps you have felt it yourself, that particular quality of being seen by someone who does not see carelessly. Leave a word in the quiet if this has found you. The following week was unusual. She had expected, after the withdrawal of Lady Vane and the departure of Crewe to the magistrate, a period of adjustment in the household, the particular unsettled quality of a ship that has shed ballast and is finding its new trim. There was some of that. Mrs. Holt managed it. With her braced patience, the maids found their opinions again, and were rather more vocal in the servants' hall than they had been under Crewe's governance. A new steward was sent for from Lord Ashford's solicitor in Bath. What she had not expected was the small and specific thing that happened on the Tuesday. She was in the kitchen ordering the week's provisions when the footman Thomas appeared with a note. The note was on plain paper, in a hand she did not recognize, and it said simply, "If you are willing, I should like to consult you on the matter of the household accounts. They have been mismanaged in ways I am only beginning to understand, and I am told you have a particular facility with numbers. Lord Ashford." She read it twice. She went to the study. She had not been in the study before. It was a large room with dark-paneled walls and floor-to-ceiling shelves, and a fire that was neither too large nor too small, precisely calibrated, which struck her as characteristic. He was at his desk with papers spread before him, and he rose when she came in, which was also characteristic, but which she had not been prepared for, and which she took a moment to absorb before sitting in the chair he indicated. They spent 2 hours with the household accounts. He was, she discovered, precise and methodical, and entirely unsentimental about the implications of what he found. When a pattern in the accounts suggested that Crewe had been redirecting funds from the household budget for at minimum 4 years, he noted it in the margin, in a small level hand, and moved to the next page. He did not perform anger. He did not perform distress. He simply marked the page and continued. She found the same quality in herself useful, in a way she had not previously been called upon to demonstrate in his presence. She had always been accurate with numbers. Not just a cook, but her father's daughter. Her father, who had kept his own accounts in a small room behind the apothecary, and who had taught her that numbers were honest when people were not. She found the irregularities the same way she found an improperly balanced flavor, by tasting the total and noticing the note that was off. By the end of the second hour, they had a fairly complete picture. It was not a pleasant picture. It was, however, a clear one, and Lord Ashford gathered the marked pages into a neat stack and said, "Thank you. This is more useful than 3 solicitors." "You might find it useful to have a solicitor review it as well," she said. "I have sent for one," he said, "but a solicitor will tell me what the law says. The numbers mean you have told me what the numbers actually say. Those are different things." She looked at the stack of papers and thought about Crew saying the cook minds her kitchen, and wondered what Crew would have said if he had known that the cook was also her father's daughter and had been reading account books since she was 12. She did not say this. She said, "Is there anything else, my lord?" He looked at her for a moment. "Not today," he said, and then, with that careful quality she had come to recognize, "Nora." She went back to her kitchen. The new steward arrived on the Thursday, a Mr. Cathcart, 45, and efficient and blessedly uninterested in the management of the kitchen, which he appeared to understand was not his domain. Mrs. Mennett. Holt received him with the braced patience she brought to all arrangements, and showed in the household, and Nora observed through the kitchen's usual channels of information that he seemed a reasonable man. She had been in the study twice more by then. The second time to clarify a discrepancy in the wine account, the third time because Lord Ashford had sent for her to discuss, of all things, the winter provision order, which he wished to handle directly rather than through the steward's office. This struck her as a degree of interest in household logistics that a baron might not ordinarily sustain, but she was not in a position to say so. What she noticed in the study, on those occasions, it was a portrait of a woman of about 25, dark-haired and composed, in the dress of the previous decade. The woman in the portrait had a quality of quiet attention that was not unlike the quality Lord Ashford himself possessed, and Nora understood, without being told, that this was the woman he had lost 4 years ago. She did not comment on the painting. She noticed it, though, and she noticed that he was aware she had noticed it, in the way that people are aware of the things in a room that carry the most weight when someone else enters. On the fourth visit, which was concerned with the Christmas menu, he said unprompted, "Her name was Catherine." Nora looked at the painting, and then at him. "She has a kind face," she said. "She had very little patience for unkindness," he said, which was not quite the same thing, but perhaps more accurate. They sat in a silence that was, she found, not uncomfortable. The fire was burning at its calibrated height. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning, light and directionless, the kind that falls as though it is practicing. "She would have found you singular," he said. She caught her breath, then remembered herself. "I am not singular, my lord. I am a cook, with a better-than-average head for numbers." Catherine would have disagreed, he said. "She did not know me." "No," he said. "But I think she would have known you in the way she always knew people who were more than they were expected to be, which she considered the only interesting kind." He looked at the painting. She was generally right. Nora looked at her hands in her lap, which were not her best feature, reddened from the fires and the cold water. She thought about 6 weeks of held silence, and the 2 bottles wrapped in cloth, and the weight of a name said quietly across a kitchen work table. "I have been thinking," Lord Ashford said, "about the nature of trust." She waited. "It is, I have concluded, not a quality one announces. It is a quality one demonstrates in the particular way a person behaves when they might reasonably choose otherwise." He was looking at the painting, not at her. "You might reasonably have chosen otherwise. At every point, you might have." "As might you," she said, before she could stop herself. He turned then, and looked at her with the full attention she had only seen in him before, at moments of genuine surprise, which were rare. "Yes," he said. "As might I." The snow outside had become slightly more committed. The fire had reached the particular settled warmth of a fire that has found its height. The clock on the mantel said 4:30, which was an hour she had never previously spent in this room, and she thought she might need to go back to the kitchen shortly, and she did not want to. "Nora," he said. She looked at him. "I should like," he said, in the same careful voice he brought to everything that mattered, "to ask whether you would consider a different arrangement." She said nothing, because there were several things he might mean by that, and she did not trust herself to answer the wrong version. He understood her silence, she thought, because he always understood more than he said. And he said, "I am aware that what I am about to say is irregular in several respects, and that irregularity requires either acknowledgement or circumvention, And I have found in my life that acknowledgement is generally more durable. She waited. I am asking, he said, precisely, whether you might be willing to speak with my solicitor regarding a proposed change of your situation in this household. Not your role in the kitchen, which I have no intention of disrupting, because you are an excellent cook and the soup is still as good as anything in London. But your station and the nature of your presence here, and whether you would find the prospect of a more permanent arrangement agreeable. She heard him very carefully. My lord, she said, I am not certain I understand what you are proposing. I am proposing, he said with a directness that was at odds with the formality of everything else he had said, that you are the most trustworthy person in this house, and that I have known it since October, and that I would like, if you are willing, to give you a reason to stay that does not depend on the running of a kitchen. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow had decided to be serious about itself. She thought about the cook. Mine's her kitchen, said pleasantly, and finally in the servants' hall with a table full of witnesses. She thought about 2 voices in a dark passage, and 6 weeks of silence, and 2 bottles wrapped in cloth. She thought about her name in his voice, across a work table at 7:30 in the morning. I would need to think about it, she said. Of course, he said. And I would need to speak with Mrs. Holt, of course. And the kitchen, she said, would still be properly managed, whatever else was decided. I would not have it otherwise, he said, with the quality that she now thought might simply be what his version of warmth looked like. Contained, and specific, and entirely reliable. She looked at Catherine's portrait for a moment. The woman looked back, with that quality of quiet attention, neither approving nor disapproving. Simply present. Yes, Nora said. I will speak with your solicitor. He nodded. Once, as he always did when a thing was settled. Thank you, he said. She rose and went to the door, and she was nearly through it when he said quietly, Nora. She stopped. She did not turn. The bread this morning was the finest I have had in this house in 6 years. She let herself, just this once, smile at the door. I know, she said, and went back to her kitchen. The solicitor arrived on a Thursday, as solicitors reliably did, and the conversation with him was methodical and a little bewildering, and ultimately, in the way of legal conversations, less about feeling than about function. What it confirmed when she sat afterward. In Mrs. Dew, Holt's sitting room with a cup of tea and the braced patience woman across from her, was that the thing was real, and the man had meant it, and the arrangement he proposed was, in the solicitor's careful language, an elevation of circumstances to a position of permanent settled standing within the household. Mrs. Holt said he had his wife's miniature moved from the study last week. Nora said, Where did he put it? The morning room, Mrs. Holt said. Where she used to sit. Nora thought about that for a moment. Then she drank her tea. He is a serious man, Mrs. Holt said. Yes, Nora said. Serious men do not make proposals of this kind lightly. No, Nora said. And you are, Mrs. Pressburse. And Holt said with the quality of someone choosing her words for accuracy rather than flattery. A woman of more than average sense, which is not a thing I say about many people. Nora set down her cup. I am the daughter of a country apothecary who kept good accounts and loved his work, she said. That is what I am. Mrs. Holt looked at her steadily. That is what you have been permitted to be, she said. It is not all you are. And I think there is a man in this house who has noticed that and is doing something about it, in the careful way he does everything. The fire in Mrs. B. Holt's sitting room was smaller than the one in the study and the one in the kitchen, but it had the same quality of being neither too much nor too little, and Nora sat with it for a moment and thought about the particular grace of being seen not as what you have been made into, but as what you actually are. There were forms to be signed, which was how these things went. There were arrangements to be made, which she made with her usual precision. There were a great many things to learn about the management of an estate that she had previously understood only from the kitchen, and she learned them with the same thoroughness she had brought to everything else. because thoroughness was not a quality that transferred only to bread. The Christmas dinner, when it came, was the best the house had produced in years. Which was Mrs. Holt's assessment, and she was generally accurate. The kitchen was managed by the senior kitchen girl who had been watching and learning for 2 years, and was entirely capable, and Nora sat at a table she had previously known only from the order in which the plates were turned to it, and looked at the man across from her, and he looked back. He was not, she thought, a man who had done this easily or lightly or without considerable private reckoning. There was still in his face the quality of the pared down, the economical, the man who had learned to spend his words carefully. There was something else, too, something that had been present in the kitchen on the morning of the cancelled wedding when he had stood without his coat in her domain and said her given name as though placing it into memory for safekeeping. She recognized it because she felt it, too, though she would not have said it aloud at a table full of witnesses. The snow that had been practicing since November had come to a decision by Christmas, and it fell outside the long windows of the dining room with the settled confidence of something that has finally committed to itself. The candles on the table were reflected in the dark glass, doubling, and the room was warm, and the soup was as good as anything in London, and he told her so. She thanked him with a gravity that matched his own. "You are going to be difficult about the soup for some time," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "I was already aware of it, my lord," she said. It seemed unkind to say so. This time the thing that happened in his face was clearly, unmistakably, what it was. It lasted slightly longer than before. She kept her own face composed and was very pleased about it. By the new year, the house had made its adjustment to the changed order with the same collective recalibration it had brought to Lady Vane's arrival. Only this time, the adjustment had a quality of settling rather than bracing, of things finding the level they had always been trying to reach. Mrs. Holt remained Mrs. Holt. Mr. Cathcart settled into the steward's position with the competence of a man who did not need to manufacture authority. The kitchen was excellently run. The accounts were in order. In February, when the first crocuses appeared at the edge of the south garden, Lord Ashford walked with her there in the sharp morning air, and they spoke about the provision orders for spring and the repair needed on the kitchen garden wall, and whether the south bed might support asparagus. And also, not that at all. He said, at the edge of the garden where the grey stone wall met the pale winter grass. "Nora!" "Yes," she said. He offered his hand. Not as a formality, not as a gesture appropriate to a walk in a gentleman's garden, but as a deliberate physical fact, an extension of a question that had been accumulating since October. She took it. Past her. The crocuses were very small and very determined, pushing through the last of the frost with the quiet persistence of things that have decided to exist. She stood at the edge of the garden in her plain wool coat with her hand in his, and the morning was cold and clear, and entirely itself. She held nothing back. Thank you for staying to the end of this story. If Nora's patience and quiet courage have stayed with you, leave a word in the comments, and come back when you need to believe again in the worth of a careful heart.